Hi, JP. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I've been wanting to chat with you for a while because I know that you're somebody who thinks about AI the way that I do, which is the technology is interesting, but how people are using it and interacting with it and making space for it in their lives is way more interesting. So, without further ado, let's dive in, shall we?
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Can you take a second to introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Sure. I am an analyst at Forrester on the Future of Work team. I've been at Forrester for almost 21 years, so quite a long time. And I am at the intersection of what people do and how technology changes how we work. So, the future of technology and work. As you might imagine, a lot of my time these days is focused on artificial intelligence. That's where a lot of investments are, that's where a lot of questions are coming up, and it's where a lot of breakdowns are happening where people invest in AI solutions. And I think, particularly a year or two ago, they expected all of the magic of AI without really understanding the mayhem that can happen and without understanding that human beings are integral to the project of AI. That is my main focus, is helping people understand how you can make humans successful with AI.
That's a great introduction. I want to take a step back from AI for a minute. I understand that you were a history major at Harvard, which, that's a pretty big pivot. And I would love to understand what took you from really looking at the patterns of the past into now looking at how technology and humans interact.
Yeah, there's more of a connection than you might imagine. So I did my undergraduate in history, and I also have a graduate degree in political science. And both of those disciplines have to look at people in a sort of collective context. How do we collectively move forward in history? How do we collectively move forward in political movements? So it involves kind of understanding a bit of sociology, a bit of economics, a bit of psychology. So you might imagine that those things are not immediately, connected to technology. But when you're in an organization, what you find is that people reject technology, people misuse technology, people don't understand technology. They think it will solve problems that it cannot. Or you may need to make some pretty big redefinitions of how people work together in order to accommodate some sort of technological innovation that's available to you. So those things are all important. I think there's also the idea of using evidence. This is very important to analysts. There are pundits who are very savvy about technology, but I think an analyst is someone who uses evidence, whether that's statistics, data, whether that's depth interviews, which I try to do a lot of, talking to lots and lots of leaders, decision makers at organizations, to try to really get at what are the barriers and what are the benefits and how can we move forward. So yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about it, that the social sciences, broadly speaking, can help you to better understand collective action, and that in turn is how organizations get work done, is in groups. Work is a team sport, not an individual one. And all of those sort of background skills can come in handy, I think.
Is there a particular period in history that you were really into in college or throughout your life?
Well, I was very interested. I wrote my senior honors thesis about sort of the colonial period of the Caribbean in particular, because I have heritage there. I have Afro-Guyanese, Afro-Trinidadian, Afro-Bahamian heritage, as well as Indo-Guyanese heritage. And my surname is from South India, from Tamil Nadu, but by way of sort of the Caribbean, the West Indies. So I was very interested in the identity that people had around, were they British? Were they Indian? Were they African? How did they think about that? And I looked at kind of this issue. And I think, identity, of course, is kind of one of these core issues. I'm not sure there's like a direct line to AI, but I do think that there is a sense in which the kind of work that we're doing with AI at least for some people, is really reshaping how they think about themselves and their jobs. There is this sort of movement toward, at the leading edge, people really start to identify with these AI tools in a way that we haven't seen before in the technology revolutions that preceded.
Not to be a little too on the nose, but I mean, I do see, if we're talking about the colonial period, you have a cultural clash moment, right? Where you have the technological culture intersecting with what might be the legacy culture of a company. And how do you introduce those things without exploiting people, without displacing them? I can also see echoes of this with, again, that identity of like, if I'm using AI to write, am I still a writer? Yeah, I can see echoes of that happening very much, and the storyteller in me wants to dive into that a little bit more. But let's fast forward from colonial Caribbean to 2013, if you don't mind, because that's when you started really focusing on the human aspects of AI, if I understand correctly. Can you take us back to that moment? Because that was way before people were picking up, even understood what Chat GPT or GPT was.
Yeah. There weren't GPTs even technologically, I don't think, in 2013. I should say I kind of cut my teeth in the industry during the dot-com boom originally. That's when I kind of originally got into technology, that transition from social sciences into looking around. Many of my classmates were involved. I became a management consultant for a little while before I came into the analyst world, which I feel analyst work is far more empirical, and I like that a lot better. But I saw this broad change of how we do things. I had a chance to spend some time in Europe as a management consultant, and then around 1999 and 2000, it was very typical for people to be mobile first. Like there was an incredible texting culture in Barcelona where I spent a lot of time, and it was just not happening in the United States. We were very much about kind of PC based applications still at that time. And of course, what was happening in Europe presaged what would happen later with smartphones. So by the time 2013 rolled around, I was sort of immersed in looking at also consumer side of the market, understanding consumer tech. And I talked to some early vendors that were interested in taking on conversations, trying to, record them, understand them. And candidly, the technology didn't work as well as it, would later in 2013. But I could see the germ of, a beginning where it's going to start listening in. It's going to start trying to decode what's going on in the conversation. And it's going to try to eventually be a participant and raise up, data and other points that we haven't considered. Think about meetings, right? Meetings are very social events. I mean, they're very sort of people as primates. They're not necessarily these sort of rigorous exercises of data and intellect, right? They're much more interpersonal connections. But there's a time when you have a meeting and you have the opportunity to use some data that exists somewhere in your organization, and you're not even taking it into account in this meeting, even though it would be perfect for the problem that you are trying to solve. So that was kind of the vision I had. I just need to say I was way off in the sense that my time frame on this was way too early. I mean, yeah, it sounds great in retrospect. Oh, I called this back in 2013, but I acted like it was going to happen in 2 years, and it's been 12, and we're still working toward that because this is not easy technology to get to work properly. Even today, we've gotten to this point where I feel like everyone is using voice recording and transcription and summarization. A lot of people are starting to use it in meetings. It's still imperfect. And if we over rely upon it, we're actually going to be poorly positioned because it's not getting everything right.
Gosh, there's so many things that you brought up that I want to dive down a rabbit hole with you on. Um, Talk to me a little bit more about how meetings are like with primates. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
You know, we tend to think of meetings as these really powerful forms of collaboration, which they can be. But when you interview lots and lots of organizations, as I have, what you learn is number one, there is a significant number of meetings that are simply You're invited and you have no idea why. People are very arbitrarily including you because it seems like you should be part of it, but you don't actually know your role in it. Number two, there are all sorts of social dynamics that happen in meetings. To take one that's pretty serious is social disinhibition effects. So let's say I'm in a meeting and the CEO of my company is in the meeting. I'm going to behave in a way that is going to self censor. I may be unconscious of this fact, but I may be trying to avoid red flags that I know exist for this important executive. I may be trying to curry favor for myself. Again, it could be completely subconsciously. But I'm going to self censor and I'm going to be performing in a different fashion. And that is very much rooted in the anthropology of primates and how systems and hierarchies work. So, in a sense, the social dynamics of a meeting are somewhat divorced from what we think, which is that these are these rational conversations that are making important decisions and considering all sides. Oftentimes, meetings are very poor experiences for many of us, and they are not necessarily achieving the goals that they set out for. They may not even have a goal. And that's the even worse piece. A lot of meetings are, in fact, simply out of custom. So, yeah, it just shows that when you really peel back the onion on meetings, we will see that there's a low ROI on some of them and we need to rethink them.
And to bring AI back into this, obviously, the popular use case is summarizing, recording and summarizing and making notes. Another use case that I find to be very helpful is preparation, right? Of creating an agenda. And I'm curious how the presence of AI can improve that experience, or, obviously you talked about undermining it, that we over rely on it, but what's the potential of improving that? And I realize this is a microcosm of a greater organizational revelation or transformation, but it is, if we're talking about primates and how we socialize, this is the core of it right here.
I think that's very accurate and astute. By preparing using AI to create a better agenda, to crystallize a purpose, to maybe help us, communicate better, we can create alignment before the social event itself happens. The real time of a meeting is not the entirety of the meeting experience. That we tend to think, oh, you just get together and chat. No, there should be a defined purpose and vision. There should be a set of goals that we have set out. So AI can be used as a tool to help craft that agenda, but it can also help us bounce ideas off of, what is a good measurement, for example, of an outcome for a meeting. People use AI as a way to bounce these kinds of ideas, get new inputs. Make sure you're not missing anything, because AI is always going to be, if you're using public AI tools or broad foundational models, it's always going to be the median of all written training material on it. So it will not itself necessarily be creative, right? It's hewing to an average. But what it will do is it'll help you say, oh, I forgot all about that aspect that is very commonplace. So that's before the meeting. During the meeting, it can take these notes. In some point, I do think that it will become more assertive, right? It's going to start to interject information, data, stuff that it retrieves from, our very large corpuses of data that we have. You're talking about a customer. And I don't know, the conversation isn't really using any data to characterize that customer. Why can't it just pop up? Now, the social dynamics of how the AI interacts is going to be interesting as well. We're not there yet. We're not in a place where people are ready for C3PO to show up in a meeting. And, C3PO is really annoying. That's kind of the whole thing about that character, right? That's kind of the joke of C3PO. So we don't have social scripts for this. I know that many people also, even today, will kick out the note takers, the AI note takers, if they haven't gotten permission to be there, including some of my colleagues. They'll say, we didn't buy into this. It's not part of our company's policy. We have to have permission to do that, or at least consent beforehand. So there will be some social dynamics with machines as well. And then after a meeting, a lot of times people say, why was I there? This was a waste of time. I don't remember what happened. There were no follow-ups. So AI can help us a little bit in terms of giving us a record of what happened, identifying the to-dos and action points and who said they were going to do it, and even start automating the follow-up on like, hey,
Right.
you've been
Yeah.
signed up for this follow-up. Now, I do think there's a danger in making this too mechanized. And like you, I mean, my point of view is always human first. But if the tools can be guardrails that help us to keep on point, and if people, by the way, we measure how people felt about a meeting without AI and then one with AI, we can start to build better meetings. And as you said, it's a microcosm of other things we can do with AI. But in this case, by breaking down each little point of, before, during, after the tasks, we can tease out which of those things people are finding valuable that accrue to a better meeting experience and more productivity.
So you have developed a concept called AIQ, Artificial Intelligence Quotient, and that measures readiness of an organization. And I realize we're going from that microcosm to the macrocosm at this point, but maybe we can have a little touch points there back to this story. But it feels like you are witnessing a problem or a pattern, and I would like to hear what's the story behind that. Is there a story about a company, you can anonymize it, that had really good tech, but they just dropped the ball when it came to people and low AIQ?
So the AIQ thesis, as you mentioned, is readiness, but it's definitely operating at the level of the employee. Does the employee have the basic understanding of AI? Do they have some hard skills and training, like prompt engineering? Do they have soft skills like motivation or confidence that they can adapt? Do they have the ethics and understanding of business risk and privacy to use it appropriately? So it's a set of things that we think you have to have in order to be successful using the tool as an individual, as a team, as an organization. And it gives people the opportunity to kind of benchmark where the gaps are. It is often the case that we find organizations who are missing one or all of those elements, their understanding, their hard skills, soft skills, and ethics. It's rooted AIQ in an older framework that I created called RQ, which was the robotics quotient, which I created about 8 years ago for the RPA revolution. So when robotic process automation came around, the similar problems happened. I mean, it's a lot more complicated with AI because a lot more can go wrong. But with RPA, there were organizations who would say, we've coded all these bots and we've gotten everything working, but then something goes wrong. It doesn't actually yield the business outcome we want. And it almost always would come back to the people who were in the process, not understanding their role, ceding too much control to the bot. The bot broke, no one noticed, that kind of problem. With AIQ, I talked to maybe some Fortune 100 companies who are very, very sophisticated, but the whole deployment is driven out of IT. And in one case, they sort of explicitly came to me to talk about AIQ because they realized we don't have any human-centered people who were trained in that, involved in this effort. So the failings that they found were that people were either completely over relying on the tool, and that meant that hallucinations would pop through in marketing, for example, the marketing copy. They would find that other people were afraid of it. So, you can over rotate on overusing it or underusing it. And so they needed to step back and find a little bit of understanding, how do we actually raise AIQ? And it's not like you can just sit someone down and train them. That training is a small piece of it, but it really is about building a system of learning and engagement and a lot of social learning where people learn from one another continuously. Because guess what? These tools change too. And they change reasonably rapidly. So if you've sort of just memorized, like, this is how it works, it could change in 6 weeks. So yeah, lots of companies that I've talked to, but I'm thinking of this one Fortune 100 that had this sort of acute realization that they had all the technical skills, they had the budget, but they didn't have a point of view on the people, and that meant that it wasn't working well.
So you are a data guru, as somebody who is an analyst at Forrester. You are swimming in statistics, and but data points are really just part of the story, right? They're characters in a story. Was there ever a point where the data just surprised you profoundly as you were doing research in AIQ or any other areas that just kind of floored you when it comes to this revolution that we're in right now?
I think this moment is incredibly jaw-dropping in some ways. Finding, for example, 100 million people using GPT technology within the first 2 months of its release. That's jaw-dropping. That number is now close to a billion people only 2.5 years later, jaw-dropping. There's a lot going on here. But I would focus on something a little bit more prosaic, perhaps. We have known since really 2023 that most of the AI systems that workers are going to choose to use and that would be valuable require some familiarity with some kind of prompt engineering, which is to say, the techniques that we use to optimize the prompt that we use to get the output that we desire. All of the major, enterprise and consumer platforms sort of predicated on some understanding of this, right? So you might imagine that this would have been something that people would invest in quite heavily. But the jaw-dropping statistic is that in 2024, 25% of organizational leaders that we surveyed said that they were actively enabling and training their workers on prompt engineering. So surely when the 2025 numbers came around, that was going to go up. And it did by 1 percentage point. 26% investing in this. Now, this is frustrating for me because I'm having these conversations about AIQ and about what are the skills we need. And admittedly, hard skills like prompt engineering are not the only game in town here, but they are something that you might have imagined would become more important. As it turns out, we have this little pulse survey of adults, and 61% of them in August of this year, so just not long ago, said that they are learning about how to use AI informally on their own time or informally at work. 61%. By contrast, I'm learning how to use AI for my company's formal training was 29%. And so that is half as often. So it's a kind of strange moment because regularly, whether we survey leaders or we survey employees, what we find is companies are definitely investing in AI solutions. They're rolling them out for more and more purposes. Some of the SaaS programs that they use are also incorporating AI components. And yet they're kind of just saying, you're on your own, figure it out on your own time. We're not really getting involved. We're not doing much. Very typical for an organization to say, oh, JP, we're rolling out this workforce AI solution and we're giving an hour of training. And I say, well, what else are you doing? That's insufficient, right? I mean, all of these AIQ skills are not teachable in 1 hour. You also need to teach the specific suite that you're dealing with or application. There's going to be idiosyncrasies toward how that particular application works. There's just a lot more to it than that. So my surprise is that people are throwing money almost at AI, but they're not understanding that this human factor is underlying all of it, and they're not investing enough in it.
Why do you think that is? I mean, what's being taken for granted here? Because it seems like there's something being taken for granted that needs to be spelled out.
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is the really big vendors who first started popularizing this kind of made it sound like there was only magic to it, that it's just this magical technology. There's not going to be any problems. Anyone can use it. You don't need any kind of formal training. One of them is that when this technology was initially released, the people who were selling it made it sound like it was just as easy as could be. They didn't want to emphasize any barriers, any challenges. They wanted to emphasize how good it was at being able to do the things that they claimed it could do, right? That is to say, anyone can use it. You don't really need any information or training or that sort of thing. So the predicate that was set was this is a transformative magical technology and you don't need to know anything else. Number two, IT people who have been rolling this out have been rolling it out thinking that it's just like any other technology. And so they're using the old rule books about how we actually go out and roll it out. And it's very linear training. It is not giving people an understanding of the philosophically different ways it works. By that, I mean, in the past, when we would operate with any kind of software, we had a pretty good sense of what it was going to do. If we asked it to, if I hit the leave button on this conference, I know I'm going to leave. If I hit the $80 button on the ATM, I know I'm going to get $80. It's very deterministic from my experience. But with generative AI, we don't know exactly what we're going to get. We may have to try a few times. We may need to keep an eye out for hallucinations, but also coherent nonsense that sounds right, might even be part of the training data, but just isn't the right answer for the problem that we have. And we need to do that in an environment where we have no social cues. So it's, if you tell me something, but you sound a little bit uncertain, I might probe and say, it sounds like you're a little uncertain. Like, let's talk about that. I mean, that doesn't happen with AI, conversations. There was a study that came out recently that suggested that, in fact, if you make decisions based on, just having conversations with AI, you're overconfident about what was said by the AI. You don't really have those social cues to be able to say, oh, it doesn't seem like it's very certain about this, unless you happen to know how to prompt and probe, to the degree of like, what's the certainty on that? And even then it might be wrong about its own sense of certainty. So basically, I think those are the things. We have the expectation of magic. We don't have the expectation of hard work. The people who are implementing this are IT people. They're using playbooks from the past, that it's a normal technology that follows the same rules that everything else has. But it really is a new way of computing, and we all need to internalize some of those lessons.
I'm noticing that when I talk to people who are just casual users of AI on their phones, for example, they're using it like almost like a search engine, right? A question answering tool. And as I become a more adept user of AI, I'm realizing that it's not just a question answering tool, it's a thought partner. It's an extension of my role in ways that help me kind of externalize my ideas, organize them, often draft what I'm trying to say. But it's also about applying frameworks that I might already know about because of my expertise, right? And using it in that way, as well as helping me do things that I might not be capable of. Like I asked AI to code or mock up a dashboard or a navigation and stuff like that. So I think that's another hurdle, right? Is that people kind of consider, if you're a casual user of AI, to just be an all-knowing
Right.
answer tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to the many ways that you can use AI.
So people are elevating AI to something that it is not. There seems to be confusion about it being some kind of oracle that is always correct. There's a lot of people who think it might be sentient, which it is not. There are a lot of people who are ready to just accept what it says as the path of least resistance. This is a very serious problem, in fact, because we know that 23% of people today say that they are using the AI overview outputs of search as the answer to their question without using traditional search. This is problematic because, again, it could be wrong. And people don't always know that. So I think as a society, people are very caught up in the time saving, the magic. And this is going to be even exacerbated by the fact that young people are on a widespread basis using it in schoolwork, sometimes in a cheating fashion, to write for them. And meanwhile, the internet itself is becoming populated with a lot of AI slop, to use the term that people use. So I prefer that people use it as more of a thought partner. As someone who spent many years learning how to write well, I think, I don't want AI to write on my behalf, but I might use AI to summarize really long set of notes that I myself took. Or I might ask it, am I missing something? If there's a more bespoke application and you have a more bespoke kind of job role, then of course you're going to use it more extensively. But the kind of work I do is very, our deliverables of reports are kind of the pinnacle of what we do. So for me, I don't think it's appropriate. Now, if I could use Gen AI to take all of my travel expense records and put it into a report and just do it for me and I look it over, sure. So I'm not against automation, but I do think people are a little quick to over rely on it without understanding where it can be weak and where it can mislead us, and where maybe you're also even violating the privacy of your customers in some cases if you expose the wrong kind of data. So there's just a level of AIQ, to use the term that I use, that is needed both for work and also, I think, in society, to make sure that these tools are used more wisely rather than poorly. And I'm afraid that there are going to be lots and lots of bad outcomes before we get to that point where we say, oh, this kind of AIQ literacy is important.
So you mentioned that people were saying, oh, we're spending an hour on training as though that's enough. Is there a time frame that you think would be enough? Is it an ongoing program? What would you like to see established, especially in these larger, Fortune 500, 2000 organizations that have tens of thousands of employees?
Yeah. So training itself is important, but it's only a small component. Organizations tend to over rotate on linear broadcast, do it at your own pace training. Now, that can be useful, but if it's all you're doing, people tend to forget, or it's decontextualized. They don't necessarily know how it fits into their world because maybe the tool hasn't rolled out, or it's just not enough on its own. There's some foundational stuff you can learn, but you're also going to want to do synchronous training where people are working together in the training. You're going to want to do weekly emails where you surface tips and videos. And maybe those videos come from what we call social learning, which is at least twice as important as formal learning. Social learning is this ongoing sense that we're in this together, we're working to learn from one another. Maybe you find someone who solved a problem effectively, and you do a little interview with them for 5 minutes or less. You have that video of someone at your own organization using the tool is more valuable than an hour of generic online training. They can, first of all, you can go and talk to that person. I mean, they're in your organization. Second of all, it's very clear how it relates to the work of the organization. I'm a big fan of lunch and learns, but the key here is also making sure that people attend them. So make sure like your middle managers are attending, set the example that the lunch and learn is going to be useful. Champions programs, mentoring programs, online venues where people can jump in and get help if they need it. All of these things are setting the base of resources that help people, because a lot of this gets done in real time. I have a problem, I want to solve the problem, I need to try this. But if I try and I fail, I'm going to abandon the tool. And tool abandonment is a big problem across workforce AI tools, because people hit a roadblock and they don't have that resource of, oh yeah, there was a video about that last week, or oh, I could just ask my mentor, my champion, or I'll drop into the lunch and learn and figure out how to do that. So all of these things need to be practices that create a system where we're learning ongoing from one another, as more than we're learning from online training as individuals. It's a team effort for sure.
Where in the organization do you see this type of program living? Is this a people program? Is this embedded in each business function?
Yeah, it's challenging because most organizations, and I generally work with companies that earn more than $1 billion a year, even good learning and development departments are not at this time in history, in this time in this industry, ready to take this on. What they can do is they can provide learning management systems, platforms for the distribution of certain kinds of training. But again, that's only a piece of it. They don't necessarily know everything that needs to be done. So more often than not, it gets run out of IT. And then they're sort of like, well, we don't know about pedagogy. Like, that's not part of our background or training or remit. Sometimes it is. So they're trying to figure this out. Often, you need to bring those two functions together to build some new ways of doing it. And I'll also add that you need to create unique content that is proprietary to your situation. All of the vendor driven training in the world, it can be very helpful, but it's not as efficacious as, this is how we use the tool in our context. This is how we've solved the problem. Here's who's doing it. Those kinds of things do need to be collected. Those stories need to be told. And so I think right now we're at this point where this is not generally being done as well as it could be, but I'm seeing some beginnings of connections between learning and development and IT to try to solve the problem.
Now, you're about to release Forrester's 2026 predictions. I can't believe that we're already predicting for 2026, but here we are. What would be a little sneak peek or an overview of the report, or a warning or an opportunity that we need to hear right now?
So I will focus on one of the bullets from the report, and it is one that I wrote. There's a lot of talk about AI and jobs right now, and it is partly driven by the fact that we do see layoffs happening across the economy. The problem is that every week I talk to a client who will say, JP, our C-level said that we're laying off 20% of the workforce and we're going to replace them with AI. And I asked them, oh, okay, so you have a mature AI application ready to step in and do that job? And the answer is, oh, no, well, we haven't started. We're here to talk to you about how do we do that. In that situation, what's happening is you have a financialized layoff that is happening without any AI involvement against the future potential that maybe there will be a successful AI that will someday fill that role. These are not jobs being lost to AI. These are jobs that are being lost to financial decisions. And in many cases, the organization has very little path toward a quick replacement because AI is not often going to replace people to the degree that people believe. And that is very true in 2026. It is much more frequently an augmentation technology than it is a replacement technology. You will find pockets where this is not true, where organizations are doing it for, let's say, contact center, which has been on a 30-year journey of automation. And so is kind of getting to that point where, okay, maybe tier one support is pretty much moving to AI and automation. There are some other jobs like certain kinds of technical writing or even some kinds of software development, although we need to be careful because that is also over popularized in the media. So there's a weird situation where people in general believe that there has been widespread job loss to AI, and it's simply not the case. And we're predicting that it will not be the case next year, but that there will be lots more concern about it, particularly if the macro economy continues to look the way it does right now. I think this is just really instructive as well if you're thinking about deploying AI in your organization, that your go-to should not be labor cost savings. It's really hard to recognize, but also when you extract those labor cost savings, you're creating all sorts of other negative effects on the morale and employee experience of your current employees that undercuts their effectiveness and could lead to rejection, by the way, of these tools as you roll them out. So we need to have a much more nuanced conversation around the interplay between jobs and AI. There are many, many people, including people who are my colleagues at Forrester, who are extremely bullish about the replacement effect. I have studied this for 11 years, and I've always found that there were more projections of job loss than there were actually jobs that you could find that were lost.
If you could categorize yourself as a pessimist or an optimist when it comes to these hype cycles over technology, and you've seen many, where would you put yourself?
I would put myself somewhere in the rational empirical skeptic camp. And by that, I mean, I don't know that I'm either optimistic or pessimistic. What I'm trying to do is to understand where the hype is happening and where things are in reality. I'll say a couple things about this. One is that the stock market is not the metric that you should use. In 2000, again, I mentioned earlier, I've been in the tech industry since about the dot-com era, and well, the dot-com era was a huge bust. That didn't mean the internet wasn't super important and world changing, because it obviously has been, maybe even more than people imagined in 2000 before the stock market crashed. So we could, and I'm not forecasting either way. I'm not a financial analyst. There could be a big AI crash in the stock market. I'm not sure. I don't know. But if there is, it really has almost nothing to do with the long-term fate of how AI plays out. We know people are making lots of investments across many different kinds of business processes. What I'm interested in is where is it actually creating value and where is it working and where is it simply not, but people are continuing to pump the hype. I think that's the most interesting and practical place to be. Better neither to be an optimist nor a pessimist, but an empiricist.
Where are people pumping the hype that isn't working?
I think the demand for things like data center is very opaque. It's hard to see. In the dot-com era, we had a big overbuild of telecommunications infrastructure, lots of what was called dark fiber. So this is fiber optic cabling that was put into the ground for future demand, and some of it sat fallow for a very long time, and they thought it was going to be used right away. It's hard to calibrate these things. And also, there could be winners and losers. Like some of the vendors could go by the wayside and they may have overbuilt their capacity. That's just one example. But I think also the models themselves are getting to be more nuanced and smaller. Like you can solve problems with smaller language models than a gigantic LLM. And again, I think that the job picture is another area where people are really pumping the hype. So things can be transformative without it all happening at the same time. Again, it's opaque, so I can't say definitively that it is overbuilt. Maybe I'm just raising a hypothesis that is floating around out there that maybe we don't know whether the appropriate level of data center investment is happening. I think it's fair to say that. I don't think we can say either way because it's just opaque.
You've had 20 years of experience guiding leaders at billion-dollar plus corporations through immense change. And if you could just distill that experience into one piece of advice that is just a universal thing, trying to build a better future for work and for people, what would it be?
Well, it would involve placing employees, human beings at the center of your analysis. That doesn't mean it's always right not to adopt technology, but adopt the technology in a way that's going to honor and assist the humans who make work happen today. Secondly, you're going to do a lot of really empirical A/B testing. You're going to get good at pilots. You're going to get good at pivoting, at adapting. Adaptation is very important. You're not going to go all chips in on an unproven pathway or technology or vendor ecosystem or anything like that. You're going to solve real problems rather than investing just for FOMO, fear of missing out. But again, I always come back to the people because the people know how the work is getting done. They are doing the work in most cases. They are the domain experts. You cannot make any of this work well without honoring their expertise, bringing them into the process, listening to them, and empowering them using the technology. That's where you're going to get your best long-term results for any technology, but I think in AI particularly.
JP, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.